Welcome to Diagnostic Imaging. I'm Whitney Palmer, Senior Editor. The COVID-19 pandemic has directly and significantly impacted both radiology providers and patients. For many individuals, screening and diagnostic studies have been postponed. This delay in imaging has actually augmented an already existing problem: patients who do not return for follow-up exams. Diagnostic Imaging spoke with Nuance Senior Director of Product Management for Diagnostics, Kloet, about his presentation during the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine 2020 virtual meeting about the pervasiveness of the problem during the pandemic, strategies that facilities can use to reduce the impact of failed follow-ups, and steps that facilities can take to potentially avoid the problem altogether. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Sandra. I do appreciate it. We're looking forward to hearing more about your SIIM session focusing on practical solutions to address the failed follow-ups in the post-COVID world. So I do appreciate your time.
Excellent. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we definitely appreciate it. To jump right in, thinking about this from a 50,000-foot perspective, overall from what you have seen and heard in the industry, how significant of a problem is this failed follow-up turning out to be during the pandemic?
Yeah, so the problem of failed follow-up was a big problem in the industry already before this pandemic started, right? We've seen different studies in the literature showing 50, 60, 70% of patients that had a radiology exam with a follow-up recommendation that actually never came back and had that exam done. We've done our own internal analysis with some of our clients. We've done over 100 clients, and we found kind of consistent results in the 50 to 70% range of patients that do not come back for their follow-up exam. And we don't have data on what happened with the pandemic, but we all have seen radiology volumes drop by 50, 60, 70%. And obviously some was because, clinics closed, outpatient centers closed, but to a large extent, it's patients that were afraid of coming to the hospital. So they might have, these patients are asymptomatic, so they don't feel sick, and they're afraid to come to the hospital. So we think the COVID situation has just exacerbated this problem, which is why we thought it was timely to kind of connect the dots between just failed follow-ups as an industry problem in itself and connecting it to COVID that just, exacerbated it.
Absolutely. So given that this is the environment in which we're operating, what are the strategies that have emerged as being the most effective in addressing this issue?
Yeah, it's communication, right? This is a communication problem, but it's the timing of the communication that is probably the biggest element here, right? So a patient gets an exam, and the report of the patient may say like, hey, yeah, well, it will say in this case, right, that you should come back for a follow-up exam, and that could go to the wrong clinician, right? That's kind of our initial problem here. If patient came into the ED for a totally different reason, that ED doctor is not going to follow up with the patient and say, hey, 3 months or 6 months from now, you should also come back for this lung nodule that we found. And even if it went to the primary care physician, and even if the primary care physician spoke to the patient about it, 6 months later, there was no trigger to say, hey, it's time to get that exam done, right? So what we're seeing, and we're now seeing that radiology is taking actually more control of the problem. And what we're seeing is the communication has to happen closer to when that patient needs to come back. And that can be to the primary care physician, can be directly to the patient. And sometimes it also depends on who makes the communication, right? So we've seen some of our clients institute a program where they get a reminder, a letter that comes from like administrative staff. And then if that doesn't result in anything, they actually have radiologists pick up the phone and I guess provide the message with a little bit more authority and say, hey, that patient really needs to come back for this exam. So I think it's timing, it's who, it's a combination of things, but it's a human problem, right? It's not it's not an IT problem, though IT can help, but it's really a human nature problem. And again, I go back to patients are asymptomatic. They don't feel sick, so they don't feel a strong reason to come back unless somebody tells them, somebody that has the authority that the patient trusts tells them like, but you should, right?
Right. So given that that's the case, and like you said, radiology is kind of taking a far more leadership role with this, what are the, I guess, main pain points that the industry can look for these solutions to address when we're thinking about making sure we get these patients back in for follow-up?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of pain points, right? I think first there is the acknowledgement that there is a problem. And that's kind of what we've done with our clients, and we analyze their reports for follow-up recommendation, and we look at then did that patient come back for a study, and we can present to them like, hey, you have a problem. But then when you drill a little bit deeper, it's a little bit more nuanced, because were the recommendations right in the first place? Was there a lot of hedging involved, right? So we've worked on being able to filter out that kind of noise to kind of really pinpoint what the problem is and that it's really there. Um, but then if you acknowledge that you have a problem, then who takes care of it and how can we do it in an efficient way, right? So traditionally, I think if you go back 5 years, the answer was, well, we told the ordering clinician that there is a problem, so it's the ordering clinician's problem to solve, and that didn't happen, right? So now it's coming back to radiology to play a role in that. But then early programs are, somebody has to read the report to see if there's a follow-up recommendation. Then that person has to go check if the patient had a follow-up, and then take action, make a phone call, do a letter. That is very labor intensive, right? So what we've now seen is automation of the process, automation of the detection that there is a follow-up recommendation, right? So having a natural language processing tool read the report, filter out the hedging, those kinds of things, and determine what the follow-up was. Automatically detecting, from exams history, whether or not that patient came back, and then auto-generating messages, right? So that we're now seeing that like a half FTE, right, can track the follow-up recommendations on, kind of a pretty large patient population, whereas before that was almost, impossible to do. So it's detection, it's automation that is making a dent in the problem here we see.
All right. Well, given that these are having an impact, what are some challenges, I guess, that we can alert facilities to as they start to use these solutions and these tools? What might pop up as a stumbling block to using them to their maximum efficiency?
Mm-hmm. I guess a couple of challenges that come to mind is what I alluded to before is the ownership, right? So who should solve this problem, right? You really have to accept as a radiology department that the old model didn't work, right? And are you now going to invest the FTEs to solve that problem? Now, what we've actually found is when people started doing this for the good of the patient, right? Make sure that that patient comes back and that they get the follow-up recommendation that they had, which is, diseases get detected earlier, the patient has a better chance of survival, it's a lower cost to the healthcare system. A very positive side effect, since we're still in a fee-for-service model, is that the extra patients coming back for exams actually brought in revenue. And we've now have a number of case studies that show that the cost of a follow-up recommendation program pays for itself by the extra revenue. So it's a win-win, right? It's better for the patient, it's better for the healthcare system overall, and it's a win for radiology as well. So I think that what we perceived in the beginning as a huge problem is radiology taking ownership and funding to have the work done, funding the staff to contact, to send letters. We kind of seen this problem solved. So now it's a question of putting the right technology to work so that you don't need an army of people. You can do it with 1 or 2 FTEs or a half FTE, depending on the size of the institution.
All right. So then for facilities or for radiology departments that are looking to start down this path, what do they need to do to be able to build that infrastructure that's necessary to sidestep this failed follow-up problem?
Yeah, I think it comes back. So there's tools on the market, software tools to find exams that have follow-up recommendation, patient tracking tools. We have our own set at Nuance. Some people do it through the EMR. But I think a couple things that people have to look out for, right, is one is filtering out, having the tool that is really able to filter out those exams that have a follow-up recommendation and eliminating false positives, right? So you have to have a tool that can deal with false positives, deal with maybe invalid recommendation, right? So one of the side effects that we've found is that there was a lack of trust. Is this the right follow-up recommendation? So now you go back to industry standards, right? So we use ACR assist models, for example, that says this is the appropriate follow-up recommendation for this exam. Do you need to retrain your radiologist to make sure they follow those guidelines. We've built tools in the software to actually do it for them, so they don't have to remember that. So that all needs to be in place. You need to make sure that you can reach your referring provider. So you have to make sure that you're ready to maintain your, let's say, your address book, so to speak, right? So that the letters actually, the emails, the letters, the faxes actually get to where they need to go. But it's most of all, it's making sure you understand the process that you're going to follow. Establish a process, because there probably wasn't one before. Who's going to do what the sequence is, right? Is everybody just going to get a letter, or are you going to do that radiologist phone call? Are your radiologists ready to do that? So it's really again, back to, it's a human process, supported by IT to make this efficient and automated. But that's probably the most important thing, is to really sit down and make sure you develop a new process to take care of this problem. And then what we see is start small, right? Instead of following every follow-up recommendation, we've seen most success if people say, like, let's just start with one thing. Let's start with, we've seen lung nodules, right? People start a lung screening clinic, and then lung nodules obviously get detected. So let's start with those, and then add thyroid, and then add other, kind of findings. So start small, fine tune your process, use technology to scale. That seems to work.
All right. Well, then, for providers or interested party members who are not going to be able to participate in the session today or not see the video, what are some of the most important takeaway messages that you would like to include?
I think the takeaway, a few things I would say is, one is find out your problem, right? Do the analysis to find what your problem is. Make sure your analysis includes that you make sure you're actually making the right follow-up recommendation, and you do something about hedging, right? That's kind of a good starting point, so that you actually have a good understanding of what kind of your core set of exams is that have a problem. Second takeaway is, make sure you implement a process, right, that everybody agrees to. What are you going to do? Who's going to do what? Start small, and scale it up as you go. Because also you need to scale up your resources as you do that. And the third piece is don't do it without automation. It is just too labor intensive to do this, to try to start a spreadsheet and have, maybe you start with an intern that could do the work or something like that, but over time, this gets too big, there's too many patients to track. So make sure you have the technology in place to help you do this.
All right, perfect. Well, Sandra, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.